Burke Cleveland Rathmel Wealth Strategies presents Compounding Your Way to Success. My generation has been raised in a different world than those that came before us. A consumer-oriented world is in our faces constantly. Young professionals want to save for the future, but many times it does not fit in with all the things they deserve right now. They tell themselves once their career gets moving, they will make up for it. Today's young professional wants to do the right thing, generally understands what the right thing is, but can't figure out how to do it. They have a lot of questions. Over time, and after fielding thousands of questions, I realized that 90% of their questions came down to understanding compounding. Before they will really understand the answers to their own questions, they have to grasp the effects of compounding, when it's working for them, when it's working against them, and to what extent it's impacting the subject matter. Everyone claims to understand that money over time can have remarkable results. We can comprehend the words, but not everyone sees its effects, even when it's right in front of them. If you've grasped compounding, questions like, which dollar is the most important dollar in your retirement savings, can be simple to answer. If you just understand the words, then it seems like a cop-out when someone asks, inflation is such a small number, how could it really affect me? And you hear that it's answered with the simple response, compounding. I'm going to take you through compounding 3 ways so that you can be better equipped to help that young professional that you care about who asks you a financial question. First, I'm going to take you through a very basic graphical presentation of compounding. Second, a mathematical presentation of compounding. And third, I will take you through several parts of an individual's financial life and present whether compounding affects it positively, negatively, and to what extent. Let's start with the decision you may have to make. You receive a bonus at the end of the year. This coin represents your bonus, whether it's 1,000 or 100,000. You can buy a new toy that you will enjoy. Let's say a TV. It lasts you 5 to 10 years and leaves you with no value when you're done with it. On the other hand, you can invest it to support some of your needs in the future. What happens if you invest it? So at the end of year 1, you have some earnings. What happens when you leave both the original investment and its earnings to continue growing? Not only do we see earnings on our original investment, but we also begin to see earnings on our earnings. In addition to seeing the growth on your original dollar in the 3rd year, you begin to see the earnings off of your previous year's earnings. So after 3 years, we're starting to see some real compounding. For the graphical part of this presentation, year 4 is quite a turning point. At this point, we can start to see compounding coming from all over the place. There's absolutely no way I could fit year 5 on a single slide. But imagine what this would look like after 10, 20, 30 years of compounding the original investment. Of course, a young professional has a long time before retirement. Why can't I put off my investing for another year? If I have compounding on my side, wouldn't 29 years be close enough to 30? All we have on this page is 4 years, but let's say we started a year later. No matter when you start, the most important dollar in your retirement is the first one you put in. The earlier you put in that dollar, the more time it has to compound, and the largest impact will actually be seen in the last few years. To show you, I want to introduce you to 3 people. Up first is John. John got an after-school job when he was young. John stashed away $500 per month so that he could invest $6,000 per year beginning when he turned 15. He continued this behavior for 5 years until he turned 19. When John went to college, he started having more wants and put the idea of saving for his retirement aside and never got back to it. Now, let's meet Amelia. Amelia hung out with John in high school. She knew he was saving for retirement, but wasn't able to save at that time. When Amelia was in college, she got a job as a personal trainer and decided she needed to catch up to John. She realized she probably needed to save longer than he did. Amelia continued to save through age 27, but her life, family needs, everything took over, and she stopped saving for retirement. Last but not least, meet Peter. Peter knew what his friends Amelia and John were doing for retirement, but he was busy partying and living up his youth. He enjoyed high school, he enjoyed college, he even enjoyed the first few years of his career. Eventually, Peter calmed down and realized he needed to start saving or else he would never be able to retire. Peter started saving at 28 and never quit. Peter saved right up to the day that the three of them were 65 and sat down to discuss retirement. Who do you think had the most saved for retirement when they sat down at 65? If the presentation in general has not given you an idea of where I'm going, look at this slide. It's one last hint. Now lock in your answer. Let's start with Peter. Look at the top of the left-hand column. Notice that Peter did not contribute from ages 15 all the way to 27. He contributed after that and contributed the rest of the time along with compounding. Over his career, Peter invested $228,000, and in the bottom right-hand column, you'll notice that it grew to exceed $2.4 million. Let's see how Amelia did. Remember, Amelia contributed from 20 to 27 and left her funds to compound after that. Amelia contributed $180,000 less than Peter, but ended with over $400,000 more than he did. Amelia's $48,000 compounded to over $2.8 million. John invested a mere $30,000 during his career and then left his retirement to compounding. That is $18,000 less than Amelia and $198,000 less than Peter, but exceeds both their savings with $3.2 million. To review them side by side, 5 years early on resulted in $3.2 million. 8 years after that resulted in $2.8 million. The 38 years up until retirement amounted to only $2.4 million. So now you have seen both a visual and a numerical representation that explains the most important dollar in your retirement savings is the first dollar, and the more dollars you put in early, the more successful your experience will be. While it's not a part of my story, there has to be someone like me that's just a little curious, what would this look like if one of them is saved the entire time? So for you, I added Susan. Susan saved her entire working career and ended up with over $8.4 million. If you are a young professional who thinks that $8.4 million is an obscene amount of money and they do not need to be saving as much as Susan did, then they need to have someone do a projection of what our generation will need for retirement. Now that you've seen compounding visually and it's been demonstrated mathematically, you have to apply compounding to your financial decisions. Not only determining whether it's working for or against you, but to what extent. How does compounding affect inflation? People talk about inflation like it's such a big deal. If it was such a big deal, wouldn't it have annualized more than 2.99% over the past 85 years? When you talk about inflation, the small number being discussed is not as important as the number of years it will compound and affect you. Let's assume the average young professional is 30 years old. They want to work for another 30 years and live in retirement for 30 years. How will 60 years of inflation compounded affect them? To demonstrate, let's go back 60 years and see how inflation affected $1,000 from 1950 to 2010. Take a 30-year-old in 1950 that wanted to retire at 60 and wanted their retirement lifestyle to be equivalent to what $1,000 would buy them in 1950 per month until they were 90. What we are seeing here is what they would have to spend to purchase the same items as time goes by. When they retired, they would need over $3,400 per month to have the same lifestyle, and at age 90 in 2010, they would have needed over $9,000 per month. The change from any one decade to another is not enormous, but after 60 years, the compounding has truly eroded their buying power. Let's take that concept and look at the actual numbers for specific items. A lot of young professionals were born on or around 1979. This is how inflation has actually affected the items they buy. This is just 20 years of inflation. How much will they be paying if they upgrade to that perfect home 30 years from now? How much will they be spending at the grocery store to buy their food when they're in their 80s? If someone leaves large excess amounts of cash in their bank account throughout their life, I realize that they won't be losing the number of dollars, but they need to realize they'll be losing how much those dollars can buy. How does compounding affect the expenses for investments? Investing includes a whole slew of potential fees and expenses. There are ways to reduce or eliminate many of those fees. How important is it to keep those fees as low as possible? Assuming one invests $1 million for 30 years and the underlying investments annually return 6.5% before any of these costs. With a 3% annual fee, you end up with over $2.8 million. If you have 2% in annual fees, you end up with over $3.7 million. But if you can keep your fees down to 1%, you end up with over $4.9 million. Does any of this math make sense to you? Gains and losses that compound on each other do not follow the simple math that we learned in school. The sequence of returns can have an impact on the actual amount you gain or lose. Let's discuss the positive. If you start with $100 and obtain a 10% return, you now have $110. If you obtain a 10% return in the second year, you've earned 21% from your original investment. While the average return is 10%, your compounded return is 10.5%. So how do losses compound? If you start with $100 and have a 10% loss, you now have $90. If you have a 10% loss again in the second year, you've lost 19% of your original investment. While the average return is a 10% loss, your compounded loss is 9.5%. The sequence of your returns is very important. While it's less important when you have long periods of time that you are investing, if you're investing for the short term, losses can be more difficult to come back from, which is the reason it's unwise to take on a lot of risk in a short-term investment. If you start with $100 and have a 10% loss, you now have $90. If you have a 10% gain in the second year, you only make back $9 of the $10 you lost. While the average is 0%, you've compounded a loss of 0.5%. Thank you for joining me, and hopefully you see how compounding has affected your life, and when asked a related question by a young professional, you have more clarity on how to answer them. This presentation was brought to you by Burke Cleveland Rathmel Wealth Strategies.